My name is Tom, and I've always been comfortable around the dead. Sounds grim, doesn't it? But that's just my life. I am 35 years old and live in New York City, where the living is loud, fast, and ever-present. Ironically, though, I find my peace among the dead. I work as a cemetery restorer. I repair, rebuild, and maintain old grave sites, most of them long forgotten by time and people. It's a weird profession, I know. Generally speaking, people tend to squirm when I say what I do because they think it is grim or macabre somehow. But I see it differently. There is just a sort of stillness in cemeteries that you don't get anywhere else. No honking cars, no city noise, just silence. And that's sort of peaceful, really. The dead, they don't ask for anything except to be remembered. I give them that, in a way. I've worked all over the Northeast, from falling apart churchyards to grand overgrown memorial parks. Each place has its own tale. Each headstone was a name etched in stone and a story beneath the surface. Most of the time, though, they are just that, stones and memories. Nothing ever feels eerie or haunted, at least, not to me. Then, a few months ago, I got a call. It was my boss, Mike, asking if I'd be willing to take on a job out in Pennsylvania. Some podunk place named Ashvale had an old graveyard that needed some attention. Evidently, nobody had done anything with it in decades, and the townspeople wanted to preserve it as historic. Sounded like a run-of-the-mill type project: clear away the overgrowth, restore stones, clean up. But Mike warned me there were some complications. What kind of complications? I asked, thinking immediately of bad weather, or difficult access. The locals are spooked by the place, Mike said, his voice dropping like he was sharing a secret. Superstitions. Some say it's cursed. But it's just old stories, you know how these small towns are. Still, they've left it alone for years. Stuff like that never fazed me. Every graveyard had its ghost stories, or its curses, but I'd just never seen anything to make me believe in any of that stuff. So I packed up my gear and headed out to Ashvale, expecting just another job. But Ashvale. Well, Ashvale was different. The drive from New York to Ashvale took longer than anticipated. It seemed Pennsylvania's landscape was endless, a messy swipe of rolling hills smothered by thick forests and an odd, forgotten small town. By the time I reached Ashvale, dusk had started to set in, casting long shadows in every part of the town. Ashvale wasn't much to look at. A clutch of weathered, old buildings huddled around a central square, a few scattered homes dotting the surrounding hillsides. The streets were mostly empty and the whole place had an air of stillness about it, like it had been left in the past. It was stagnant, almost like it hadn't changed in decades. No modern cars, no bustling shops. Just a diner, a general store, and a small gas station. I pulled in front of the diner to get a bite and ask for directions to the cemetery. The minute I stepped inside, I knew I was getting the once-over, just a few locals, sitting at the counter and in booths, their conversation stopping the minute I came through the door. They weren't unfriendly, really, but there was a reserve in their eyes, like they were trying to take my measure. The waitress was an older woman, probably in her late 60s, with graying hair pulled back into a loose bun. Wearing just a plain apron, her hands moved in measured slowness to clean a glass behind the counter. When I asked about the cemetery, her movement stopped just a beat too long. "You're the one they sent?" she asked, quiet, but carrying through the silence that filled the diner. I nodded. "Yeah, here to clean it up. Get it back into shape." She said nothing immediately, instead glanced over her shoulder at the rest of the patrons. They promptly began feigning interest in their coffee. Finally, she leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not many folks go up there. You won't find any help, if that's what you're looking for." "Why's that?" I asked, more curious than concerned. "People here. We don't talk about that place," she said, eyes flicking to the window as if expecting someone or something outside. "It's been abandoned for a reason. Best you do your work and leave as soon as you can." She stood up straight, returning to the counter, which pretty much told me the conversation was over. Still, she directed me to take the old dirt road at the edge of town, past the woods, and up the hill. Seemed simple enough, but the warning lingered. I drove out of town as the last smudges of daylight disappeared, leaving me the soft gleam of my headlights to steer by. The dirt road she'd mentioned was narrow, little more than a trail, really, bordered on both sides by thick trees. Their branches scratched at the sides of my truck as I drove up the hill. The forest was growing denser, the air colder. I finally made it to the cemetery and parked the truck outside, stepping out into the chill. It was an old, rusted iron gate, hung crooked, creaking with the whistling wind. The gravestones beyond were hardly visible in that dimness, just dark shapes jutting from overgrown grass and vines. I stood there for a while, and I saw it. It was different than the other cemeteries I'd worked in. Not just neglected, but forgotten, like even time had moved on without it. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something stir in the back of my head. Doubt. I was back in the cemetery the next morning, daylight giving me an infinitely clearer view of what I was dealing with. The place looked even more decayed in the pale light. In places, overgrowth had simply taken everything over, vines over and through headstones, thick brambles snaking between graves. The stones themselves were weathered and cracked, some of them tilted at odd angles as if the earth beneath had grown restless over the years. I pulled my truck over near the front entrance, offloaded my tools, shovels, brushes, stone cleaner, everything I might need to start the slow process of bringing these overlooked memorials back to some semblance of their former selves. I walked deeper onto the cemetery grounds, hearing the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, taking in the detail of the graves. The first thing that struck me was how utterly blank many of the headstones were. No name, no dates, just a smooth expanse of well-worn stone. I stopped by one of the older parts, squinting at the faint markings remaining on some of the stones. There was writing there, symbols, maybe, but so worn it was impossible to tell what they had once been. I reached out and ran my hand over one of the larger stones, tracing the rough, uneven texture beneath my fingers. The stones were old, much older than any grave markers I had worked with, and there was something out of the ordinary about them too, as if they had been deliberately scrubbed clean of personal details. I spent the most of that day in clearing the overgrowth. The work was tedious, yet I didn't mind it, for I'd done this kind of thing several times. However, there was something peculiar about the place that dragged the hours on longer than usual. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew I was totally alone. I sat down around noon, next to one of the bigger stones, and wiped the sweat from my brow. It was quiet in the cemetery, unnaturally so. No birds, no insects, just the rustling of wind through the trees and the creaking of the rusted gate. I have been in plenty of quiet cemeteries, but this was something else. The silence felt heavy, as if the place was holding its breath. Later that afternoon, when the shadows had stretched out longer, I observed something peculiar. One of the headstones, one that I had passed by a little earlier in my wanderings, apparently had moved. At first, I thought it was just my brain making things up. But no. It was different. It had shifted a little to one side, and the foundation was now slightly exposed, revealing more of the stone under the dirt. Kneeling, I swept the loose earth away to find near the bottom of the stone a faint, almost imperceptible marking was visible. It was another symbol, unlike the others. It did appear intentional, carved into the stone carefully, though time and elements had also worn this one down. I traced the outline with my finger, feeling the cold stone beneath my skin. I couldn't tell what it was, but something didn't sit right with me, as if I'd uncovered something better left buried. The sun began its sinister setting, casting long shadows in the cemetery, as I cleaned up at the end of the day. I gathered up my tools and headed for the truck, feeling the weight of an eerie feeling begin to settle over me. The unmarked graves, the displaced headstone, the signs and symbols all were beginning to get to me. Maybe it was just the loneliness getting to me, or maybe this place had something more to it than what I cared to admit. As I drove clear of the cemetery and back toward town, a feeling lingered that I was leaving something behind, something I hadn't found. The next morning, I woke up ill at ease. The exertions of the previous day's labors had left me physically tired, but it was more than that. Something of the place had nestled in my brain, the silence, shifting stones, and weird symbols. Still, I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let a little creepiness stop me. I snatched a quick breakfast and headed back into the cemetery. Driving out of town, I saw something weird. The few people I did see on the streets seemed far away. Not just quiet, but, in some ways, wary, as if they knew something that I didn't. They all averted eye contact, turning away as I would drive past. Subtle, yeah, but unsettling. I felt like an outsider now, as if they knew why I was there, but they wouldn't acknowledge it. I stopped by the general store to pick up a few supplies. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the smell of wood polish. The man behind the counter was older, in his 70s, deep lines etched into his face. He eyed me warily as I approached. "Mornin'," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm working up at the cemetery. Figured I'd grab some extra gear." His expression didn't waver, but his eyes flickered something like recognition, but not of the good kind. He nodded and handed me each item without saying a word. I paid silence, my pause to ask him about the place. Something about his silence stalled me. I gathered up my items and left. I could hear the murmurs of two women talking in hushed tones outside as I walked back towards my truck. They stopped abruptly when they saw me and then quickly dispersed in separate directions, looking over their shoulders. What was clear was that they knew something about the cemetery. Something they didn't want to talk about. When I arrived at the cemetery, an overcast sky made the light across the landscape little more than a grayish film, and the entire place dead, more so than at any previous time, anyway. I immediately set to work, clearing more of the vines and dirt. But my mind kept drifting back to that headstone I'd uncovered the day before, even though I couldn't touch on exactly why that was. But the symbol, that odd tilt of the stone, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved, and I didn't have the key pieces. As the day wore on, I couldn't help turning back time and again. There was no one there, no animals, no birds, nothing. Just me and the graves. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. By late afternoon, I had cleared off a big area of the cemetery. That is when I noticed something new. In the very corner where the graves were oldest and most overgrown, there was a huge stone monument. Thick brambles partly obscured it. It was not like the other graves, for this was huge, of dark stone, and its face was deeply carved, the carving worn smooth by time. I approached the monument, pushing the overgrowth aside to see it better. The carvings were weird, an intricate design that seemed to twist and curl almost like vines themselves. There was an inscription at the base, but it was barely readable. I hunched down closer and traced the letters with my fingers. The words were faint, but I could just make out part of it, "To those who must not be remembered." A chill went down my spine. What kind of monument was this? Who were these people buried here, and why such effort to erase their names and histories? I stepped back, looking around the cemetery. Suddenly, it didn't feel like a resting place for the dead, it felt like a prison. But for what, I couldn't yet tell. I was working, but my mind kept wandering back to the inscription. It really sounded unsettling, "To those who must not be remembered." More questions arose in my mind than the answers. Who wanted to inter people in utter obscurity? And why? I decided I needed to find out more. I went that evening, when the day was well at its end, to the town's small library to try and find records of the cemetery. It was a small building, placed between a diner and an old hardware store. Inside, it smelled of musty paper and old wood. There was one librarian present, a middle-aged woman sitting at the desk. I then asked her if they had any record of the cemetery. She gave me a funny look but ushered me in the direction of the town records. The archives were but a small, dusty room in the back of the library. I'd spent hours sifting through old newspapers, town records, and maps, but there was almost nothing about the cemetery. No records of who was buried there, no mention of origins, but a few references to existence from the early 1800s. Then, just when I had given up hope, I discovered something, an old journal buried amongst a pile of forgotten books. It belonged to a man named Elias Turner, caretaker for the cemetery during the late 19th century. His entries were limited, but from what was written, it was disturbing. Turner wrote to strange happenings at the cemetery, stones moved on their own, voices in the wind, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched. The following entry caught my eye, in particular. They told me to leave it alone. They warned me. But the stones. They shift when you're not looking. And the dead. They whisper when the wind blows. I've heard them. I know it now. This place is not meant to be disturbed. There are things buried here that should never see the light of day. I sat in the dim light of the library, rereading the words over and over. Turner had been through what I now went through, the shifting stones, the silence, the sense of watched eyes. It wasn't all in my head. Something was going on in that cemetery, and whatever it was, it had been going on for more than 100 years. I closed the journal and left, my mind reeling. I had to know more. But as I walked through the quiet streets of Ashvale, I couldn't get rid of the nagging feeling that I was being followed. The night was cold, and the wind whispered through the trees, carried with it the faintest echo of a voice. I quickened my pace, but the feeling didn't leave me. The next morning I was up early, determined to press on, but something had changed. The nagging feeling in my stomach had become something heavier now, a weight I could not shake off. All of me urged to return to the cemetery to dig deeper, not just literally, but something in my stomach told me to back off. Yet, I couldn't help but feel haunted by my discovery in Elias Turner's journal. It was almost a dare, just a challenge issued by him to anyone who came across his words, find this truth he had been too afraid to face. It was overcast, with heavy cloud-shaped canvas slung low in the sky, casting a dull, gray light everywhere in Ashvale. I loaded my truck up and drove up the all-too-familiar narrow dirt road that led to the cemetery. The trees lining the road seemed taller now, darker, and as if they were closing in on me. The air was colder than it ought to have been this time of the year, sharp with a chill that cut through me. At the iron cemetery gates, the old entrance, rusted over, let out a loud shriek with the wind, swaying back and forth, like a beckoning call. I stopped a moment, my hand laid on the cold iron bars of the gate. I turned and glanced back down the road, half expecting to see someone, anyone, standing there, watching me. But there wasn't anyone. Just the wind and the trees. As I stepped inside, that eerie silence wrapped around me again. That kind of unnatural quiet where it seemed the world had simply stopped turning for that one moment. Even the rustling of leaves sounded far off, as though muffled through the thick atmosphere of the cemetery. I turned toward the section of graves where I had been working, the headstone still in position it seemed where I had left them, or so it would appear at first sight. But as I approached, I could see it again, one of the stones had moved. Not far, but enough. And not alone, two others had shifted, also, in and out from their positions that morning. The symbols I had seen on the monument, the intricate carvings, now they seemed to glow faintly, as if they were pulsing with some hidden energy. That was when I heard it. The faintest whisper on the breeze. The softness of a breath, a voice just out of earshot, passing between gravestones. My chest constricted as I spun back, searching the cemetery for movement. There wasn't any. No one. Just rows of silent graves and that damn whisper, louder, insistent now. I took a step towards the center, my heart pounding against my chest. As I did, I noticed something new. In the farthest corner, near the ancient monument I'd uncovered, the ground seemed disturbed. The earth was freshly turned, the grass uprooted and scattered, as if someone or something had recently been digging there. I approached the spot with caution. My breath fogged the cold air as I knelt beside the disturbed earth. The whispering ceased, and everything went absolutely dead still. I reached down, brushing away the loose dirt to find something lying solid, not a grave marker, but a chunk of stone, half buried in the earth. It wasn't part of a headstone, though it was a slab, flat and smooth, with more of those strange symbols etched into it. They were clearer now, not worn down like the others. I brushed away more dirt, revealing the entire slab, which was about the size of a manhole cover. As I ran my fingers over the carvings, I felt a slight vibration beneath my hand. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there, an unmistakable pulse of energy, coming from the ground below. That was when I realized the whispering hadn't stopped. It had moved. It was coming from below. It felt cold, impossibly cold, as if the air around it had cooled down several degrees. I floated my hand over it and paused. Something in me screamed to step back, not to touch, not to dig deeper literally and figuratively, but I couldn't help it. The pull was too strong. This wasn't curiosity anymore, this was something more, deeper. I took a spade from my bag and carefully began to dig around the edges of the stone slab. The earth was loose, as if it had been recently disturbed by some person or thing. As I dug, the slab seemed to grow larger, the edges widening greater than what I had seen initially. It was huge, and the more I uncovered, the more intricate the carvings became. I cleaned most of the slab after several hours of labor. It was round, 5 feet in diameter, and indeed there were substantial carvings. This almost felt like symbols interwoven into each other, twisting and spiraling toward the center of it, where a small indentation was set. The whispers were louder now, more distinct, though I still could not make out the words. It was as though they were dancing at the tips of my fingers, just out of reach. I retreated a step, attempting to comprehend what I was observing. The slab didn't resemble a headstone, or even a part of a monument. It resembled more of a seal, something intended to cover or protect whatever lay beneath. And that's when it hit me, this wasn't a grave marker. It was a door. I hunched down again, my hand moving over the indentation. Perfectly smooth, like it had been worn down by hundreds of years of touch. Acting on instinct, I set my fingers into it, pressing lightly. A rumbling noise, softer at first, like the grinding of stone on stone, far off. Then the ground at my feet stirred, and the slab began to rise. It moved slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, then with quickening pace, it slid to one side and disclosed a narrow, dark opening underneath. A cold current of air whistled out of the opening, bearing on its breath the unmistakable scent of damp earth and something else, something old, musty, decaying. I bent over the opening, shining my flashlight down into the darkness. The beam lit a set of stone steps, leading down into what appeared to be a crypt. I should have turned back then. My body screamed at me to turn around, to leave the cemetery and never return. But I couldn't. There was something down there, something that had been calling to me since the moment I set foot in Ashvale. And I needed to know what it was. I went down the stairs more slowly now, my hand grasping the cold stone wall for balance. It was growing colder with every step, and the whispers were getting louder. They were all around me now, it seemed like 1,000 voices speaking at once, yet they were still too faint to understand. My flashlight flickered at the bottom, its beam hardly reaching through the thick darkness enveloping me. The chamber was small, no larger than a single room, but its walls were lined with more of those strange, twisting symbols. The ceiling was low, forcing me to hunch slightly as I stepped inside. At the far end of the chamber, something caught the light, a great stone altar, covered in dust and cobwebs. The moment I approached the altar, something lay on top, an object wrapped in some sort of decaying cloth. The object looked ancient, older than anything I had ever laid my eyes on. My heart then beat faster and faster as I reached to brush my fingers against the cloth. With that, it simply disintegrated, showing what was beneath. It was a book. The cover was thick, made of a sort of leather that had darkened with age. The edges were frayed, the pages yellowed and brittle. But it was the symbols etched into the cover that really caught my eye, the same as those on the slab, the same as those on the grave's twisting, spiraling designs that seemed to shift and move when I stared at them. I hesitated a moment, then opened the book. More symbols were on the pages but different. They weren't just designs, they were writing. And though I couldn't understand the language, I could feel the power behind the words. It was as if the book was alive, humming with energy, its secrets pressing to break through to my brain. And as I had leafed through the pages, one name recurred time and again, Ashvale. It was there, hiding amongst the symbols, stitched into the text in some dark thread sewn right through the heart of the book. And with it, another word. A name. Elias. I froze, it hitting me like a gut punch. Elias Turner, the caretaker from the journal. This book had belonged to him. He had found this place, just like I had. And he had known its secrets. My mind just raced, putting it all together. The cemetery, the blank graves, shifting stones all connected. This place wasn't a burial ground. It was a prison, and Elias had been its warden. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they knew I was closing in on something. It felt heavy in the air, smothering, the temperature continued to drop, and now I could see my breath fog in front of me, standing there in the middle of that ancient, forgotten chamber. And then, all at once, the whispering stopped. It was silent, more unnerving than the whispers had ever been. Slowly, I turned, my flashlight casting about the chamber, half expecting something or someone to emerge from the darkness. But there was nothing. Only me, the book, and cold, smothering darkness. I knew then that I had to leave. Whatever Elias had started, whatever he had been trying to contain was still here. And I had disturbed it. I clutched the book, jamming it deep into the bag, and ran up the stairs. Beneath my boots, the stone steps boomed. On the surface, the slab had already moved into position, concealing the crypt beneath. The cemetery was quiet now, still and immobile as if nothing had occurred. But I knew that would be far from the case. Down in those depths, something had stirred, something that should not have been awake for ages. And now it watched me. That night, I could hardly sleep, for every time I shut my eyes, the chamber reappeared before me again, the stone slab sealing something beneath the earth, the ancient book humming with energy. More noticeably worse than the images, however, was the residuum feeling that something was watching me, something from that crypt, something I had awakened. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, running over in my mind the happenings of the last few days. The whispers, the shifting stones, the crypt. It was a nightmare, only it hadn't been. It was real. Too real. Now, I had a piece of that nightmare within reach. The book. There on the table beside me, quiet and inanimate, its worn leather cover almost innocent in the dim light. Still, I knew better. That was no innocent thing. Nothing about that place was. Somewhere along the line, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sun had barely begun to rise, a gray, flat light filtering through the thin curtains of my bedroom window. I sat up slowly, the weight of exhaustion bearing down on me. I wanted to leave. Every fiber in my body was screaming at me to get out of Ashvale, to drive away and never look back. But I couldn't. Not yet. Too many questions remained unanswered, too many loose strings. I had to know what I was dealing with. I got dressed quickly and went downstairs. The inn in which I was staying was quiet, almost oppressively so. Even the floorboards didn't creak under my feet, and even the sounds of the town outside seemed to have dimmed. I grabbed my bag, keeping the book tucked safely inside, and went out the door. I walked the streets of Ashvale, this feeling of movement, the shifting of something. Today, the town felt different, heavier. People moved through the streets quickly, heads down, avoiding eye contact. It was as if they knew that something had happened in that cemetery, that something had been disturbed. I headed to the diner, aiming to have some breakfast and perhaps catch up on some of the gossip in town. But as I entered, all conversation ceased. The heads all turned to me, the atmosphere thick with something I couldn't quite place. The waitress was the same older woman who had served me that first day. She stood behind the counter, her eyes narrowing as I approached. "You went up there, didn't you?" she asked, her voice low, but sharp. I looked at her, feeling a twinge of anxiety, wasn't sure how to answer. "Yeah, I'm working on restoring the place." She shook her head, as if in sorrow, and slowly replied, "You shouldn't have done that." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with warning. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She looked around the diner, her eyes touching on other patrons before returning to mine. "There's some things in that cemetery best left alone. You don't know what you stepped into." A chill ran down my spine. "You're talking about the crypt, aren't you?" Her expression darkened, and she fell forward, placing her voice at a whisper. "It's not just a crypt. It's a tomb, a prison. Whatever is buried in there, it's been there for centuries. We've kept our distance. That's why the cemetery was left to rot. It's why no one goes up there anymore. But you went digging. And now, it's awake." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words sunk in. "What do you mean, it's awake?" With a heavy exhalation, her gaze drifted down to the counter for a moment before returning to mine. "This town. It's been ours for centuries. Beneath Ashvale. There's something. Something far older than even it is. The graveyard was built on top to lock it in, to let it be forgotten. But once you bring that up, once you let it out." She didn't finish the sentence, but then she didn't have to. The meaning was clear enough. "You need to leave," she said now, her voice urgent. "Take whatever you found and get out of here. Before it's too late." I left the diner in a fog, her warning still echoing inside my head. I walked back to my truck, my gaze lifting up the hill behind the houses where the cemetery sat, its ancient stones just barely visible through the trees. Something was up there, something dangerous. And I had woken it. But what was it? What had Elias Turner known? And more importantly, what was I supposed to do now? I should have left then. I should have packed up my things, driven out of Ashvale, and never looked back. But I couldn't. Something of the book, the crypt, the warning, it gnawed at me. I needed answers. I spent the rest of the day poring over the book, trying to decipher its cryptic symbols and ancient writing. It was slow, frustrating work. It wasn't until I started flipping through the pages that it began to take shape, a story buried in the layers of text from another world. It spoke about an ancient cult, a group of people who lived in Ashvale centuries ago. They had worshipped something dark, something powerful. They had sealed it underground when their time was up and had used the cemetery as a cover to keep the world outside from finding their secret. The book talked of rituals, sacrifices, and power that had laid dormant for generations. But now, I had disturbed it. The seal had been broken, and whatever lay sleeping beneath Ashvale had finally started to stir. That night, I lay awake, the whispers louder, more insistent. I thought about the waitress's warning, the crypt, the slab. I knew I had to go back. There was something I hadn't uncovered yet, something I needed to see. Early the next morning, I returned to the cemetery. The air was heavy and cold with fog, the sun barely perceptible through thick gray clouds. I trudged to the crypt, my footsteps heavy on the gravel pathway. As I neared the slab, that feeling returned, the pull, the same energy I had felt when I'd first uncovered it. The whispers were louder now, swirling around me, filling the air with their strange unintelligible voices. I stood over the slab, my heart pounding against my chest. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I had to find it. Slowly, I knelt down, placing my hand on the cold stone surface. And that's when I heard it. A voice, clear, distinct, cutting through the whispers. It wasn't coming from the crypt below. It was coming from behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I froze, my hand on the cold slab. The voice that had spoken was soft, yet firm, cutting through the thick oppressive air like a blade. Slowly, I turned, expecting to see someone standing behind me, another visitor to the cemetery perhaps. But there was no one. The fog swirled around the graves, thick and impenetrable, shutting off the world beyond the stones. The cemetery was empty. I was alone. Yet the voice had been so clear, so close. It wasn't a whisper, it was something else, something more deliberate, like someone standing just behind my shoulder. "You shouldn't be here," the voice repeated, louder this time. I stepped back, my hands instinctively reaching for my bag, where the book lay hidden. My mind was racing. The whispers had been there since I'd first stepped foot in this place, but this wasn't the same. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't my imagination. Before I could do anything, the ground gave way beneath my feet. The slab, which had felt so solid only a moment before, groaned and slid further to the side, exposing more of the dark opening beneath. The stone steps dropped down into the earth, disappearing into the gloom, but this time I wasn't alone. Standing at the edge of the crypt was a figure. A man, no, a shadow, its form no more definite than the fog clinging to the ground. His outline flickered like a flame, but his face was clear. Elias Turner. I knew in a second who he was from those pictures in that ancient magazine in the library. The deep-set eyes, the weathered face, the face of a man who has seen far too much. He shouldn't have been here. Elias Turner had been dead for over 100 years. He stared at me, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark and empty. "You did what they couldn't," he whispered, his voice as good as inaudible, but the words fell with an unnatural gravity. "You set it free." My breath had caught in my throat, and I retreated another step as my mind raced to encompass what lay before me. Elias Turner, caretaker of the cemetery, who had written of the crypt, who had tried to warn others in his journal, he stood before me now as vivid as the stones beneath my feet. "I don't understand," I stammered. "What place is this? What have I set free?" Elias bent forward, his mist-shrouded form undistorted in the fog. "It was never meant to be found," he said, cold and detached. "Ashvale's secret. The one cursed and buried below ground. We built the graveyard atop it, to hide it in and keep it imprisoned. Then, the townspeople. They began to shun it. They let it rot. And they thought if they just left it alone, it would stay underground." I shook my head, the weight of his words raining down on me like blows. "The book. The symbols. I didn't know dash." "The book," Elias said, interrupting, his eyes darting to the bag slung over my shoulder. "It was mine once. A record of what we did to keep the evil sealed. But the seal is broken now." I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. The whispers were growing louder again, swirling around us, angry, frantic. Fog thickened, creeping up over the gravestones, suffocating the air. I could feel it now, something moving beneath the earth, something that had been asleep for centuries but was now stirring, waking. "I have to fix this," I whispered, my voice shaking. "I have to stop it." Elias's eyes went dark, his face inscrutable. "You can't stop what's already begun. But you can choose what happens next." The earth beneath us shook once more, the tremors now hard and savage. The crypt, the dark, yawning hole beneath the slab pulsated with a life all its own, as if something down there was clawing its way to the surface. "What do you mean?" I asked, my chest starting to heave with panic. Elias didn't respond immediately. He looked toward the crypt, his face setting in stone. "There's no going back on what has happened. But there is a choice. You can walk away, leave this place to its mercy, let it take what it will. Or you can sacrifice yourself to seal it once more." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sacrifice. The book had mentioned it, buried deep within the cryptic symbols. The cult that had once lived in Ashvale had made sacrifices to keep the evil contained, feeding it with the blood of the living to keep it dormant. And now, that choice was mine. "I can't." I began, my voice breaking. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way," Elias said, cold, detached. "I tried to warn them, but no one listened. The evil has waited too long. It's hungry now. It needs a life to go back to its slumber." I felt my heart hammering in my chest, my breath catching in short, ragged gasps. The crypt seemed to yawn wider beneath my feet, the dark void calling to me, whispering my name. The whispers. They weren't just in the wind anymore. They were in my head, in my blood. I could feel the pull. One final look did Elias cast my way, his dark eyes capturing mine. "The decision now rests with you. You may stay or you may leave. But whatever you decide, remember this. There is always a price." And with that, his form began to dissolve and break apart, disappearing into the fog as if he never had been there to begin with. I stood there for a very long moment, staring at the open crypt, the decision weighing upon me, almost physically. The whispers were louder now, screaming in my ears, begging me to act, to do something. My hand tightened on the strap of my bag, the book inside suddenly feeling like a lead weight. The choice was mine. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring into the black maw of the crypt. The air had grown colder, the fog thicker, swirling around me like a living thing. The ground beneath my feet vibrated with a terrible energy, a pulse that seemed to echo the beating of my heart. The whispers, the ceaseless, maddening whispers had grown so loud now, they were almost deafening. They weren't just in the air anymore. They were inside me, filling my head with their desperate, angry voices. And yet, beneath all that noise, there was a strange, terrible clarity. I could leave. I could turn around, walk away from this place, drive out of Ashvale, and never look back. Whatever was buried here, whatever curse lay beneath the earth, it wasn't mine to carry. I had been a stranger to this town. I didn't owe it anything. But if I left, the evil wouldn't stay buried. It would grow. It would consume. My hands were shaking as I pulled the book from my bag. The cold, ancient leather was smooth against my palm, and the symbols etched into its surface seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, pulsing in time with the whispers. The power in this book was real. I'd felt it since the instant I'd laid my hands on it. A record, a tool, a weapon, and one that Elias had once mastered, but which now fell to me. I turned the pages, the weird symbols dancing before my eyes. There must be something in here, something that would explain what to do next. The further I read, however, the more I realized. There was no ritual. No spell to reverse what had been done. The only way to stop this was to feed it. To give it what it needed. A sacrifice. My blood. I flung the book to the earth, my breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. The crypt yawned wider beneath me, and I could feel it now, something ancient, something hungry, something that had waited for centuries. And it was calling to me. The air was thick with tension, the fog swirling faster now, as if it was alive, feeding on the rising dread. I stood at the edge of the crypt, the whispers inside my head growing louder, more frantic. The cold air pressed on my chest, suffocating me with the weight of the choice before me. The stone slab beneath my feet hummed with a gentle vibration, a heartbeat of something far older than this town, older than anything I knew. I knew what I had to do, what Elias had said was the only way to stop what I had unleashed. Yet the reality of it, of offering my life to save this town, was just a little too hard to swallow. I finally turned towards the crypt, the gaping hole of darkness below, and I knew it was waiting. The thing beneath the ground wasn't sleeping any longer now, it stirred in hunger for that life denied to it for so many centuries. But was my life enough? Was it really going to satisfy it? My breath caught in my throat as the earth seemed to shudder beneath me. The ground was shifting, the slab stirring again, the crypt itself opening wider, calling me down. Whispers clawed at the edges of my mind, begging me to give in, to offer what was needed. I was already on the edge, teetering on the brink of submission. But then something shifted. A figure materialized in the fog, emerging slow from the mist. I thought at first it was just another hallucination, like Elias. But as the figure stepped closer, I saw this was somebody else, somebody alive. It was the waitress from the diner. Her skin was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something else, too, determination. She edged closer warily, her gaze darting between me and the crypt, as though she knew it all, what had happened and what was about to unfold. "I couldn't let you do this alone," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't have to be the one." I stared at her, dumbfounded, my mind reeling behind her words. "What do you mean? It has to be me." I disturbed it. She shook her head, stepping closer. "That's what they want you to believe. But it doesn't have to be you. It just has to be someone." The implication of what she was saying hit me in the pit of my stomach, a gut punch. She was offering herself in my place. Relief and horror washed over me in a wave. I had accepted the sacrifice, but now there was another option. Someone else was here, someone else who could take the fall. "I have lived here my whole life," she said, her voice no louder than a whisper. "I have heard the stories. I know what's buried beneath Ashvale. Generations my family has kept this secret, just like Elias's. Yet we knew it would wake again. We knew it would come for us." I shook my head, the weight of her words settling in. "You don't have to do this. I'm the one who." She cut me off. "It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that it ends." Before I could stop her, she stepped past me and headed toward the crypt. The whispers were louder now, almost eager, as though the entity below sensed she was there. She knelt down beside the opening and placed her hands on the cold stone. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though I wasn't sure if the words were for me or for whatever lay below. Then, without another word, she vanished into the dark. The earth heaved with force the moment she was gone. The whispers grew loud and louder, the very air thick with screams from these fevered and desperate voices. I stood, immobile, not able to move or think. The fog danced faster, thicker, I could barely see my own hand in front of me. Then, in an instant, it lay still. The fog began to lift, the air still and quiet. The ground beneath my feet was solid again, it had stopped its trembling. The crypt was sealed once more, this time the slab of stone sliding into its former position with one final, resounding thud. It was over. But at what cost?